During his years at university, a young man rented a small house in a private community in Monterey. It was a modest dwelling, but it stood out for the colorful glass on its front door, which allowed one to see if the hallway light was on. The community had a desolate and sinister air. Several houses were half-built or abandoned, and the area fell into an unsettling silence when nightfall came. The guards who once watched over the place never lasted long. They either disappeared without explanation or simply quit, leaving the residents in a constant state of alert. Worried about the lack of security, the neighbors decided to reinforce their measures. They changed the lock on the front door and installed barbed wire on the perimeter wall. One night, the young man returned from a trip for his university practices. He arrived at the community entrance in the early morning, exhausted, with his phone battery dead. He realized he had forgotten to ask for the key to the new lock. He was wearing only a light jacket and carrying a backpack with dirty clothes. The street was completely silent, and an unexpected chill made him shiver. He looked around. The shadows of the empty houses seemed longer than usual, as if they were watching him. He decided to circle the perimeter, heading toward an empty lot full of debris and overgrown weeds. The air felt heavy, as if the atmosphere itself was surrounding him, pressing down. As he walked, he stumbled upon a piece of rusted metal and heard a faint murmur, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. With his heart pounding, he reached the wall separating the lot from the community. He remembered the barbed wire they had installed and cursed his poor memory. Darkness seemed to devour every trace of light, and for a moment, he felt as if something was watching him from the shadows. He thought of returning to the street, but then saw a wooden beam leaning against a pile of rubble. With effort, he propped it against the wall and climbed up. He used a t-shirt from his backpack to cover the wire, though a careless movement left a scratch on his arm. As he fell to the other side, a cold sensation ran down his spine. As he stood up, he noticed a faint flickering light coming from a nearby house. It was a yellowish, almost green color, one he didn't remember seeing before. That house, as he believed, had always been uninhabited, but now something inside was moving. A creak sounded behind him, and a trembling voice whispered, "Did you hurt yourself?" He turned quickly and saw her. An old woman with pale skin and sunken eyes, wearing a wide, unsettling smile with yellowed teeth. She sat beside a tall bush that swayed slightly, though there was no wind. There was a moment of absolute silence. The young man felt as though the sounds of the world had faded, and only the echo of his nervous breath filled the air. The old woman stood with a movement that made her bones creak and stepped toward him. "I don't want to be alone with him anymore," she murmured, her smile stretching unnaturally. Fear paralyzed him for a moment, until his survival instinct pushed him to run toward the gate at the end of the path. The lights in the other houses remained off, as if the world was deaf to his terror. The old woman screamed behind him, "You came to keep me company," and let out a sharp, childlike laugh, disturbing and high-pitched. It was a sound that didn't seem human, but a twisted blend of voices and distorted echoes. When he reached the gate, he looked back and saw the old woman running after him, with gray strands of hair shaking in the wind and legs moving with impossible speed beneath her nightgown. He managed to open the door to his house and slammed it shut, but not before she broke the glass and shoved a thin, grayish, cracked arm through. The bony, sharp fingers groped, seeking to grab him. He froze, paralyzed, as the hand twisted violently. After what felt like hours, it retreated, leaving broken glass scattered on the floor. There was no blood, just a faint metallic smell in the air. Outside, the laughter continued, echoing down the empty street, until the lights in the other houses finally flickered on and the neighbors came out. The young man, trembling, sank onto the sofa and closed his eyes, but fear kept him awake. At dawn, some neighbors knocked on his door, concerned. They spoke of a certain Lady Margaret, an old woman who had lost her family under strange circumstances and whom no one wanted to talk about. That night, as he tried to sleep, he heard a soft knock on the window and a whisper that froze his blood. "We'll see each other soon." David had heard of the house on the hill, an ancient stone mansion surrounded by tall, withered trees that creaked in the wind. Since childhood, the villagers had told stories about lights flickering on in the abandoned house and shadows moving behind dust-covered windows. No one ventured close except Carmen, the elderly medium who lived at the end of the cobbled street. Her hunched figure, always draped in a black shawl, would walk without fear toward the place every full moon. Driven by curiosity and a mix of skepticism and fear, David decided to follow her one night. The moon rose, round and cold, as he saw Carmen, cloaked in shadows, stride firmly up the path leading to the mansion. He followed closely, but just far enough that his footsteps wouldn't betray him. Upon reaching the entrance, the medium stopped before the dark wooden door, extended her hand, and muttered words in a language he didn't understand. The door creaked and slowly opened with a long, agonizing groan. David stepped forward, holding his breath. Peering through the slightly ajar door, he saw the elderly woman lighting a candelabra, its flames casting dancing shadows on walls covered in mold and ancient paintings whose eyes seemed to follow every movement. Carmen moved deeper into the house, and he followed, feeling how the temperature dropped unnaturally with each step. The main hall was a large vestibule with a double staircase that rose like a fan. In the center, a round table held a black tablecloth embroidered with golden symbols. The medium sat down and began to hum a monotonous, rhythmic melody that filled the air like a distant buzzing. The flame of the candelabra flickered, and a chill wind rose from nowhere, snuffing out the light. David was plunged into darkness, barely able to see Carmen's outline, her voice now lower and more guttural. "They are here," she said in a tone that didn't seem like her own. Suddenly, a collective murmur filled the room. Distinct voices of men and women, of children and old people, rose like a spectral choir. David shuddered as he felt an icy hand brush his shoulder. He spun around sharply, but found nothing but empty air. Carmen, motionless, whispered, "Don't be afraid. Not all of them mean to harm you." Before he could react, the room was filled with more defined shadows. Translucent figures with hollow eyes and mouths open in expressions of pain. One of them, a man with an open wound on his chest, advanced toward Carmen, reaching out a trembling arm. "You left us alone," he whispered, his voice torn from the depths of a grave. David wanted to back away, but his legs refused to move. Another figure, a woman with tangled hair and dressed in what appeared to be a torn nightgown, turned toward him. Her eyes were bottomless black pits. "Did you come to hear our stories?" she asked, her voice breaking into a hollow laugh. Carmen raised her gaze to David, her eyes now empty, completely white. "I warned you not to come," she said in a deep voice as the figures swirled around him. A sensation of icy cold gripped his body, and the air thickened with the scent of damp earth and wilted flowers. The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment he saw Carmen's face, older and more weathered than before, her lips curling into a knowing smile. "The living do not belong here," one of the figures declared. Then, in the blink of an eye, everything fell silent. The house returned to darkness, and the medium, exhausted, collapsed onto the table. David regained his movement and ran for the door, not daring to look back. That night, as the mansion faded behind him, he knew he would never again follow Carmen, nor doubt the village stories. The voices and faces of those he had seen would haunt him in his dreams, and the cracked laughter of the woman in the nightgown would echo in his mind like an eternal, disturbing refrain. In a small, forgotten village, there was a legend about an old woman named Consuelo, known to all as the guardian of the mirror. It was said that Consuelo never left her dilapidated cabin, located at the edge of the forest. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, and only the bravest claimed to have seen the faint glow of a candle flicker inside on the darkest nights. The elders of the village whispered that, in her youth, Consuelo had been a powerful seer who guarded a cursed object, a mirror that, they said, was a doorway to another world. Mario, a young carpenter's apprentice, heard the story one night at the tavern, amid laughter and warnings from the drunken locals. He didn't believe a word, but his curiosity was piqued when he heard that those who looked into the mirror could see not only their own reflection, but the faces of souls that had not yet crossed over to the other side. One new moon night, Mario decided to challenge the village's superstitions and approach Consuelo's cabin. When he arrived, he noticed that the wood of the door was covered in strange marks, symbols that seemed to spin and move in the dim light. Before he could touch the door, it creaked open slowly, its sound slicing through the air. At the threshold, the old woman was watching him. Her eyes were dark, like wells that devoured light, and her skin was wrinkled and pale, like old paper. "I knew you would come, young one. They all come sooner or later," she whispered, her voice seeping into his skin like a cold gust of wind. Mario swallowed, feeling trapped by his own recklessness. Inside the cabin, the air was suffocating, thick with the scent of melted wax and dried herbs. In the center of the room, covered by a black velvet cloth, stood the legendary mirror. Consuelo stared at it for a long moment, and without taking her eyes off Mario, she uncovered it with trembling hands. The young man's reflection appeared on the silvered surface, but he was not alone. Alongside him, figures began to appear. Pale faces with hollow eyes that stared at him unblinkingly, some of them smiling in grotesque ways. One of them, a little girl with disheveled hair and a dirty dress, raised a skeletal hand and pressed it against the glass, as if trying to escape. Mario took a step back, but Consuelo stopped him, gripping his arm with a strength that defied her age. "It's too late," she said. "They've seen you." The mirror vibrated, and a faint murmur filled the cabin. The figures began to move, twisting and writhing, while the girl in the dirty dress laughed in a way that echoed in his head. Mario felt a chill crawl up his spine as he saw his own reflection looking back at him, its eyes no longer his, filled with an unfathomable darkness. Consuelo leaned closer, her face inches from the mirror, and murmured something that only souls could understand. The figures recoiled, and Mario's reflection returned to normal, though now his eyes held a gleam they had never had before. "You must leave," the old woman said, "and never look into mirrors again. You are one of them now." Mario staggered out of the cabin, feeling the weight of all the eyes that followed him from the other side of the glass. From that night on, every time he passed a mirror, he could see, out of the corner of his eye, the girl in the dirty dress and her broken smile, waiting for the day he would dare to look at her again.